Okay, this is lesson 9-4 notes. And we're going to solve equations by factoring. Okay, so if I kind of look, let's see, down here a little bit. So this should look familiar to you without the equal zero part. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to work on factoring. And now we're actually going to come up with a solution because we have an equal sign. Okay, all right, so when I come up here and I look at this first example, I love when I see parentheses because that means they've already factored it, okay? So step one is to factor. Once it's factored, you're then going to set each factor, so this guy and this guy, equal to 0 separately and solve it. So I'm going to take 4r plus 1, I'm going to set it equal to 0, and r minus 2, I'm going to set equal to 0. So now I'm going to solve each equation. So I'm going to subtract the 1 here and get 4r equals negative 1. And then divide and get negative 1/4. Over on the next one here, I'm going to add the 2 over and get r equals 2. And those are my two solutions. Okay, all right, let's go to the next one. Okay, so now something else that's really important about this is we must have it set equal to 0. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to move this 6x over and get it set equal to 0. Okay, so set equal to 0. So I'm going to have x squared minus 6x equals 0. So remember here, we're going to subtract the 6x over to the other side here, so that cancels. Okay, and when that cancels over here, we have nothing left, so we have a 0. Okay, now it does say solve by factoring, so we need to factor. So remember, our first step in factoring is always to pull out a GCF. So I'm going to pull out an x and get x minus 6. Okay, now we're going to set each factor equal to 0. So I'm going to have x equal to 0 and x minus 6 equal to 0. Now in this case, this guy's done, right? There was your first factor. There's your second factor. Okay, so x equals 0 is done. On this guy, I'm going to add the 6 over and get x equals 6. And those are your two solutions. Okay. All right, so again, same thing. We're going to set equal to 0 first. So I'm going to move that 100 over to this side. So I've got 9n squared minus 100 equals 0. Now, as a side note, guys, I highly recommend this n squared, wherever you've got your squared at, that this number be positive. You will see that I will constantly always work with a positive number here, and that's because it makes your factoring a little easier. Okay, so now in this case, I see a difference of squares. So I'm thinking about, right, can I square root? Yep. Do I have subtraction? Yep. And can I square root? So if the answers are yes, you have a difference of squares. So I've got 3n minus 10 and 3n plus 10 is equal to 0. Okay, so now again, set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So on this first guy, I'm going to add the 10 over, and then I'm going to divide by 3 and get 10 thirds. Okay, on the second guy, I'm going to subtract the 10 over and get negative 10 and divide and get negative 10 thirds. Okay. Okay, on this guy, again, we're going to set equal to 0. Now, you have to make sure, though, that when you set equal to 0, that you are writing it in standard form. So when I bring this 5x over, I'm going to drop it right in the middle there and get x squared minus 5x minus 14 equals 0. So I've still set it equal to 0, okay? Now I'm going to try to factor or find factors of negative 14 that get us negative 5. Okay, so when I'm thinking about it, 2 and 7 would work. And then if I make the 7 negative, when I add them, that gets me a negative 5. And when I multiply, that gets me a negative 14. So I have x squared goes to x and x. I have a plus 2 and a minus 7 equal to 0. So again, now set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So I get x equals negative 2 and x equals positive 7. Okay? All right, as a side note, just so you know, whatever your biggest exponent is here, that's how many answers you should have. So if I have x squared, I get 2 answers. If this was x to the 5th, then I would need 5 different answers down here. Okay? So whatever your biggest exponent is how many answers you should end up with. Okay, going to the next one now. Okay, so this one's already set equal to 0. Okay, I do have a number out front, so I'm going to go ahead and start my list. 1 times 3, 1 times 24, 2 times 12, 3 times 8, and 4 times 6. All right, so now I'm looking for a 17. 17 out of this. Okay, I think I might have found something here. So let's see. So I'm going to go 1 times 8 is 8. 3 times 3 is 9. And if I make them both negative, that gets me negative 17. And that works because a negative times a negative, right, will give you a positive. Well, that didn't work out at all, did it? Okay, so just keep that in mind. All right, so we've got a 1-3 combo in front. So I got a 1y and a 3y. On the back side, I have a 3-8 combination, and we know that they're going to be negatives. Okay. All right, so now we're going to set each one equal to 0 and solve. So I've got y minus 3 equals 0. Remember, the same thing as 1y. So y will equal positive 3. On the second one here, y minus 8 equals 0. I'm going to add the 8 over and divide by 3 and get 8 thirds. So 3 and then 8 thirds are my answers. Okay, so on this guy, I'm going to go ahead and move my 6x over. So I'm going to bring that guy right here, and I'm going to get 3x squared plus 6x minus 45 equals 0. Now in this case, there is a GCF of a 3, so I'm going to pull a 3 out first, and I'm going to get x squared plus 2x minus 15 equals 0. So now I'm looking for factors of negative 15 that add up to 2, okay? And I'm thinking 3 and 5, let's see, positive, so I'm going to need a negative 3 and a positive 5. So now when I multiply them, right, I get that negative 15, but when I add, I get to that 2. Okay, and then we're going to rewrite, keeping that 3 out front, x minus 3 and x plus 5 equals 0. Okay, so now technically I have 3 different factors here. Okay, I said each one equal to 0. So 3 equals 0. That does not work. That is impossible, so we're going to go ahead and throw that guy out. Now I'm going to do the next one. X minus 3 equals 0, and x plus 5 equals 0. So I'm going to get x equals 3 and x equals negative 5. And those are your 2 solutions. And keep in mind, I had an exponent of 2 up here, so I get 2 answers, not 3. Okay? Okay, on this one, again, when those numbers are really big, let's double check for those square roots real quick and see if those will work. So let's check for 5 times 5 and 9 times 9. So 5 times 9 is 45. 45, yep, that gets me a 90. I think that's looking pretty good. So I have 5r and 5r, right? And then my backside are 9s. Now it's all positives. So I'm going to have just plus 9 equal to 0. So I have 5r plus 9 equals 0. I subtract the 9 off and get negative 9. And then when I divide, I get negative 9/5. Now, technically, when I do the same thing, since these guys are the same, I'm going to get the same answer twice. So in this case, I do have 2 answers. It's just that they end up being the same thing. So I have r equals negative 9/5 and r equals negative 9/5. Now in this case, guys, you can just write one of them down. You don't need to take the time to write both of them down, but I'm fine if you do. Because again, we have 2 answers. It just happens to be the same number in this case. All right, and the last one we're going to look at today. Brad tossed a baseball in the air from a height of 6 feet with an initial upward velocity of 14 feet per second. Evan caught the ball on its way down at a height of 4 feet above ground. Using the equation, 4 equals negative 16t squared plus 14t plus 6, determine how long the ball was in the air before Evan caught it. Okay, so now the question is how long? Well, guess what? We have nothing but t's right here. All right, so if we already have t's, that's what we're going to be finding. How long? We're going to be finding time. Now, real quickly on this, you don't have to worry about plugging any information in, okay? So we're providing you with the equation, all right? But in this case, 4, this is your finishing height. You caught it 4 feet above ground. Negative 16 actually has to deal with gravity, so that's always in our problems. 14, that's your initial velocity. And then 6 feet is where it starts. That's your start height, 6 feet. So that's where all that information comes from. Now, in reality, it doesn't really change what we're going to do, though. We're still going to set it equal to 0, just like we've been doing. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to subtract the 4 off over to the other side here. And I'm going to get 0 equals negative 16t squared plus 14t plus 2. Now again, you have a GCF, and I will always pull this negative out here in front. I want to have a positive front number just to make my factoring a little easier. So in this case, I'm going to pull out a negative 2 and get 8t squared minus 7t minus 1. Okay, now we're going to start my list. 1 times 8, 2 times 4, and then 1 times 1. Now we know that our signs are going to be positive and negative here because I have a negative 1. So we're subtracting. Since they're different, we're going to subtract to get to that negative 7 there in the middle. Okay, that's better. And let's see here. So 7. Okay, so I see kind of right off the bat here, 1 times 1 would be 1. 8 times 1 would be 8. And then if I make the 8 negative, that's going to get me a negative 7. So that's looking pretty good. So I got an answer right there. So 0 equals, keep the negative 2 out front. I've got a 1t and an 8t. Okay, I have a positive and a negative. Oh, and I got 1s on the back side. Okay, now I want my 8 to be negative, and I want my 1s on the outside to be positive. Okay, all right, now that we've done that, we're going to go ahead and set equal to 0 and solve. So I'm going to have 0 equals negative 2 and throw that out. 0 equals 1t or t minus 1. And 0 equals 8t plus 1. Okay, so now I add the 1 over here. On this one, I'm going to subtract the 1 and then divide and get negative 1/8 t. Now, think about this for a second. If we're talking about a baseball being in the air, which answer is going to make sense? 1 second or negative 1/8 of a second? You cannot have negative time, at least not yet, right? We can't go back in time yet. So this guy is an answer, but he doesn't work, okay? So don't worry about him. So this right here is the answer I'm going to go with. So my answer is going to be, is going to be 1 second, okay? And that's my solution. All right, and that concludes these notes.